the entire FBI operates under a playbook. That's called the DIOG. It's the Domestic Intelligence Operations Guide. That playbook tells you how to open it, when you can open it, what tools you can use at what stages. Appendix G, like golf, is the specific one that I continue to call out to my members of Congress that have done nothing about it. And that particular paragraph under Appendix G allows an intelligence investigation to be opened under anybody in America if it's properly stated. And I can state it about anybody that I've ever met. I don't think I would have a hard time articulating a reason to open an intel investigation to anybody. I certainly could open one into you. I know there's one into me.
This is Little by Little with Andy Schechtman.
All right, welcome back, everybody, to another issue of Little by Little. And with me today, I have a man named Kyle Seraphin, and I'll get into Kyle's background in a moment. First thing I want to say, Kyle, is, and we'll get into why I'm saying this, but I want to thank you for your service to this country. I wanted to have you on this show because you are a true patriot. You are an American hero. You are someone that we should all aspire to have the morals and the character that you have. And I mean that sincerely from the bottom of my heart. The more that I dug into your past to do a modicum of preparation, the more impressed I became with who you are as a person. But let me just back up a few months anyway and kind of just go over how you and I met. We have a mutual acquaintance, someone you've known, I think, most of your life, who had watched me talk about the issue of fraud and I don't know, I guess it's fraud is anyway, easiest way I can explain it in the precious metals IRA business, whereby there are a lot of companies, because it's a federally non-regulated industry, that are taking advantage mostly of senior citizens, and mostly in the form of precious metals IRAs. And it's really something that I can't underscore how awful it is. And this person reached out to me. Fortunately, we were able to help this gentleman, and I'm very happy about that. We were able to help him get his portfolio in order and be made whole. But he mentioned you, that you were someone I needed to talk to. You were someone I needed to reach out to because of your past, which we'll get to in a moment. And I did. I sent you a message, and right away you got right back to me. And true to your form, you helped shine a light, allowed me on your podcast, allowed me to talk about this, for which I'm very grateful. And I think it was met very well. So just a thank you for coming here, for your service to this country, for being in the Air Force for 4 years and dedicating your life, as we'll talk about in a moment, in other areas in the pursuit of making this country a better place. So before I go on, I just sincerely, honestly want to say thank you. You're a hell of a guy, and someone I would aspire to be, to have even a fraction of your moral fabric. And it's a pleasure to have you here for sure, Kyle.
Andy, that's probably too kind. I'm not sure I deserve most of that, but it is appreciated. And I was very grateful to make your acquaintance and to talk about the thing. It's always interesting when I think this is a characteristic of God's hand in the world, which I talk about to people. I would never have fathomed that I was as a 27-year-old, as a 25-year-old, as a 22-year-old, I would have never fathomed that I'd be talking about that in my 40s. But the older you get, the wiser you get, hopefully. And it does seem very fortuitous that as I find issues or as I see things that happen in this world, I'm also introduced to people that know more about it, that I have an inkling that it's happening and other people can help me shine the light on it more. So I didn't set out to do any of the things that we're doing right now, and I certainly didn't set out living like an intentional way, but I've always lived with a set of principles. You know, they have that old question, which Kamala Harris doesn't know how to answer, which was, what is your biggest weakness? Classic job interview question, right? In any job interview. And everybody always has some little throwaway gimmick line. I didn't know what mine was until I actually started interviewing to go be an FBI agent. And the answer that I came up with, which is actually very true, is I have this outsized sense of injustice. And I always have. And it doesn't matter whether people are bullies or whether they're fraudsters or whether they're just taking advantage of people that they can. I've always hated it. It really never sat well with me when someone was doing something that was immoral and unjust and taking advantage of those. It's one thing for strong to go and manipulate strong. It's really something that just puts me off when people who are strong manipulate the weak. And so maybe that's probably what's driven a lot of the things that I've done. And it's, it's Forrest Gump style. It's accidental. It's certainly not intentional, other than that seems to be a guiding principle. But that's my biggest weakness, because it gets me very passionate and riled up to the point where I'll fight fights I ought not to, probably.
Yeah, well, I don't find it a weakness. I mean, that's hero quality, and we should all have a friend like you who stands up for things that he sees wrong. We should all be more like that, quite frankly. And that, you mentioned the FBI, and you are someone who joined the FBI, but became, I think, noticed or I don't know if I want to say famous. You certainly gained notoriety for speaking out against the FBI, becoming a whistleblower, if you will, and by revealing instances, it says, of political bias and procedural misconduct within the FBI. And I'm going to get to that in 1 second. One of the reasons, Kyle, that I really wanted to have you on this show is, I've been someone who's been talking about the dollar and the image of this country beginning to change. I focus a lot on the BRICS. I've talked about in over 4,000 YouTube videos how we are losing, potentially, the hegemony. I would argue that's gone, but even starting to erode the supremacy of the dollar. And I realized in my research, Kyle, that it's not just economics and numbers. It's not mismanagement of the world reserve currency. It's not just fiscal irresponsibility and brain-dead monetary policy. That's part of it. But when put together with the things that we see around us, I'm not sure how old you are, but I was born in 1970. I'm a kid of the 70s. And, back then, things were more simple. We didn't have questions of who was a boy and who was a girl. We didn't have questions of the nuclear family. We didn't have questions on things such as, your worth being measured not by your merit and accomplishments, but by your lifestyle. And I think some of the things, and I'm very outspoken about it, that are troubling me far more than the economic shortfalls of this country and the stupidity of the people who are managing, if you will, the world reserve status, is the questioning of so many things in this country that make this country special, such as immigration, such as the Justice Department, such as the electoral system, such as the FBI, pillars that people would have risked their lives for in years past to come to this country, to flee authoritarian regimes, to find equal opportunity, to find equal treatment under the law, to come to a system or to a country where the elections are done fairly. All of these things, regardless of how people feel about them now, much of the world questions many of these pillars, many of these institutions. And so in talking with you and doing a little bit of digging about who you were, all of a sudden it just clicked that this is exactly what I feel in many ways, the kind of person that you are, and standing up for things that need to be spoken about. I have sometimes asked myself, why am I saying the things that I am? Now, I don't want to compare myself even remotely to what you've been through. And we're going to talk about that in a second. As a whistleblower, someone who has tremendous courage, and someone who stands by his ideals. But the things that you talk about and the patriot that you are resonate with me. And if you listen to any of my podcasts, you would see in every single video I do, I talk about the breakdown in society. And I say it's intertwined with our mismanagement globally. And ultimately put together, it makes us makes this a far more dangerous position our country is in, monetarily, economically, politically, socially, morally, spiritually. All of it is put together. If more people had your ideals, this country would be a hell of a lot better. If we weren't defined by who we voted for in the last election, if we respected our authority, if we respected our teachers, and if we respected our parents, and we respected, just a lack of respect is permeating through everything I see. And it's gotten to a point now where I look to people like you as a hero, in the respect that you're standing up for what this country is lacking. And I, as I mentioned, you were or have stood up against the FBI. You call yourself a whistleblower. And I want to read something just so people can understand who you are. And I'm going to ask you some questions. And, this was a tweet that you put out where someone was accusing you of doing this kind of with ulterior motives. And you say, just to get this correct, I gave up my FBI career, benefits, status, paycheck, sold my home because we had no income for 14 plus months, moved my 3 kids and wife into my parents' extra 2-bedroom, kept my family of 5 with pregnant wife in 200 square feet for 6 months, drove hours in each direction to make sure our voice was heard on Dan Bongino's Fox show and other programs, started a podcast in the 18-foot RV powered by an extension cord, put 12 to 15 hours a day into learning a completely new skill set, did hundreds of interviews talking about government malfeasance and what actual corruption looks like from an inside perspective. You go on to talk about the look on your kid's face who got pulled from 3 groups of friends and are poised for their 4th move in 2 years. Or what really struck me, Kyle, is when you said, or when my wife and I breathe a little easier at 6:05 a.m. because the FBI kicks indoors at 6 a.m. You want to save this country? Start thinking critically. Ask what outcomes are coming from bombshell reports. Me and the Suspendables USA gave information that have spawned several congressional investigations and had dozens of state attorney generals launch inquiries. You know what the results are? Nothing. My friends are still suspended forever, and the FBI got funded a new headquarters. I mean, if that doesn't tell everybody the kind of person you are, look, I want everyone watching this show to sign up to Kyle's YouTube channel, follow him on X, follow him, because this is the kind of person that we need to emulate. This is the kind of person we need to listen to. This kind of person who gave up a career and everything that he had worked for us in the name of doing what's right by the American public. And I don't say that because you're on this show and I want to cozy up against you. I wouldn't have asked you on if this wasn't really important to me personally as an American. I'm a patriot. I'm the least likely person to have ever achieved the level of success I have, Kyle. And I owe it all to this country, the opportunities this country gave me, where I worked my ass off and I outworked everybody. And it was my effort and the equal opportunity, not equality for all, but equal opportunity for all, that allowed me to get to where I am. And I thank God every day I was born here. And I'm horrified by what I see. And when I come across people like you, I have a little bit of hope that the American spirit is still alive. And I need more people to understand what you're talking about. So if you're watching this show, please sign up and follow Kyle. It's something I think you'll be glad you did. So enough of the cozy and the kissing and the snuggling up. I just want you to know it's very, very, very sincere. So with all of that being said, I mean, it's justified, man. And I think people should know this. So let me just ask you a couple questions. So what initially motivated you to join the FBI, and how did that perspective change over time?
I joined the FBI because I think it came from a formative place where I grew up in a Catholic school, a bunch of different schools. I went to 10 schools before I got to high school, but the one school I spent the most amount of time in was my high school, which was the Jesuit College Preparatory School in Dallas. And the motto of that Jesuit school, and as I understand it, all Jesuit schools, is men for others, which sounds really good to a 16-year-old and a 17-year-old and an 18-year-old, but you don't really know anything about the world because you're 18. You haven't had any burdens put on you. You haven't had a family, most likely. And so as an 18-year-old, that didn't really sink into me. It really hit me about the age of 25 or 26. And I realized that here I am, I'm a young man of the world. I'm bright beyond many of my peers. That's just statistically obvious to me, but I'm not doing anything with it. I wasn't creating anything and I wasn't destroying anything is the way I said it. And at that time, I was working for a movie studio as a finance analyst, and I'd run restaurants before that, and I'd worked in corporate sales. And I just was bouncing around trying to figure out what is this purpose? Like, why am I on this earth and what am I trying to provide? And so I started thinking about what would my purpose be if I had been alive 10,000 years ago? This is the actual thought I had. What is Kyle Seraphin's purpose in a tribe of a small people? And I tried to figure out, based on my skills and my physical abilities and my mental abilities, where would I fall? What kind of role would it be? And it's a protector and a hunter and someone who's able to embrace the physicality, but also the strategy. And so I knew I needed to find a way that I would be in front of whatever the threat was that was coming towards my tribe, my group, my people, in this case, my country. So I was like, well, that's the military. That's what you do. That's where you go. And I'm 27. I'm right on the edge of not being able to even enlist. But I enlisted at the age of 27. I was the oldest guy on my basic training flight. And I joined to be in Air Force Special Operations, which is not a common route for special ops. It's a very, very small part of the Air Force. But I had gotten a contract to go be in the Navy and work in the special warfare community. And I didn't like the way the contract lined up. And I was foolish and I didn't go with the Army, which would have been probably a good move. And so I ended up trying to be a combat controller. That was the thing I wanted to go do. And that was the first route. And in the back of my mind is that forever? And the possibility was, yes, maybe that's something I go do forever. Maybe I die doing that. That was something I really had to come to grips with as someone who was older than an 18-year-old jumping in. I thought about losing limbs. I thought about living in a wheelchair for the rest of my life if that's what was demanded of me. So I made sure that I was comfortable with the sort of thing that I was ready to engage in, which is not necessarily common for everybody. I don't think everybody thinks it through that way, but I did. And then the other question is, what's the alternative? If I get out of there, where do I go? And I talked to an uncle who had been working in the government for a number of years. He retired as a GS-15, so that's the top of the general pay scale. And he said, you could go join the FBI, but you got to have a skill. So do you have a language skill? And the answer was no. Are you an accountant? And I said, no. He said, are you an attorney? No. Do you program computers? Do you have a, MIS degree? And it's like, no, across the board. So the only other option was a prior background in law enforcement or military. So I was like, okay, well, I could go join the military, do this job, and then bring it into a law enforcement career if I wanted to work domestically. And so that was the kind of the plan, if you will. I didn't really know it was going to be a thing because I promptly forgot about that plan when I joined the military. I just forgot about it altogether. Did my time, didn't have the experience that I hoped I would have. I think the other funny thing I've learned in this bizarre journey I'm on is that I can't recognize what God's plan for me is until I look in the rearview mirror. It feels like he draws straight with crooked lines is what someone told me. And so I feel like that is very true and certainly true in my life, because how do you become a restaurant manager who used to sell Dell computers that ends up in the FBI and then kicked out of the FBI and still meets a degree of success that people think is not tragic? I'm not a charity case at this point, so that's big. But I did my time in the military thinking I was going to go overseas, thinking I was going to go fight in a war. That's what I signed up to go do under a Democrat president, by the way. Barack Obama was in office. He stepped into office in January of 2009. I joined the military in June of 2009 and shipped off the basic. And I did my time, and I was never called upon to deploy. I would have loved to. I actually asked to do that, but I spent my entire time in a training environment, which is really frustrating because the government spent about $1 million training me on all kinds of different skills, from becoming a combat diver to being a parachutist with the Army Airborne Unit. I went and did that, and that's not particularly exclusive, but all these things moving towards, I became an air traffic controller, I became a paramedic. These various skills, I just kind of collected them as I went along and then never got to apply them. And so I applied to various different government agencies when I got out looking for some purpose. None of them responded to me. And then my wife and I tried to figure out, what are we going to do now? Because I got married and we decided to go start a bed and breakfast in Vermont, of all things. And I'd never been to Vermont, by the way. We just decided to move there without ever having been there. So in that strange moment, we got to Vermont, and here I am. I'm a paramedic, military veteran. I've got all these abilities to jump in and get a job, because you do get some special abilities when you're a veteran. They have to consider your application. And I get a call from the FBI. And by the way, my wife and I decided we didn't want to move to Vermont at the same time. And they said, hey, we'd like to continue the process in becoming an agent. And so we got you to take a test, which I did. Then they asked me to do these interviews. And over a period of 18 months, I was slowly brought in and eventually hired on to work in the FBI in another June. That was in June of 2016, which mirrored my June of 2009. I joined the military. So June's always been a big month for me. And my first daughter was born in June. So kind of all interesting, these Junes keep lining up. And then I've basically gone from not knowing what my focus was to sort of getting closer to the tighter tolerance of a left and right boundary of what was my mission set. And by joining the FBI, I did that in 2016. I went to work in a thing that I would have never chosen for myself, which was counterintelligence. And it turns out that by working in counterintelligence, I was exposed to names like Peter Strzok, whose names were on case files that I inherited. He was the supervisor that approved some of the investigations that I got that were old when I got them. I saw things in the political beast that is the Washington field office of the FBI that I really wouldn't have otherwise seen. I knew all the people that took a knee for BLM in the summer of 2020. And so I was put in a place to know and see and hear things and witness things that I think are wrong. And as I kind of put that experience together, that I had no business being there. I saw things in Portland, Oregon. I was in front of the White House the day after Donald Trump was driven into the bunker. So I witnessed all these weird moments that are really big things nationally when you think about weaponized government and the failings of our institutions and the improper use of our government. And I happened to witness them, a lot of them firsthand. And so, as you said, I became a whistleblower. I started doing that almost immediately in 2017. I started asking questions about how our national security apparatus was being applied to Americans. And so I started seeing things. But I think it was because I joined so late in life. I started in the FBI when I was about 35, which is uncommon. I was about 10 years older than many. Not the oldest person that's ever joined, for sure. But I had a decade of life experience so that when people told me at the FBI Academy that this is the best job in the entire world, I have that natural question that you would ask anybody if you're a grown-up. You'd say, well, what other jobs have you had? And mostly what I found out is that people who worked in the FBI had not had other jobs outside of the FBI. By and large, their experience was either government or FBI exclusive, with very small exceptions of people who had worked in other law enforcement agencies. Most people had not come in with a lot of life experience, certainly not a decade of it. And so a lot of folks tend to take that as an indoctrination as opposed to a time to ask questions. And having already gone through indoctrinations in the military, I had a pretty open mind about knowing what was and wasn't. But I think the best job I ever had in my life, for whatever it's worth, like people have said, this is the best job. The best job I ever had was working finance for Warner Brothers. It was amazing for me. It was not a thing that I knew how to do off the top of my head. So I was always being challenged. I had some computer programming. I had the ability to be physical. I went to work every day on a motorcycle. I wore a t-shirt and jeans. I made decent money for a single guy. And I worked in Burbank outside of Hollywood, which is great if you're a young guy and you don't have any family. That was the most fun I ever had going into work until I started doing some of the things in the FBI. But the problem was there was really not a lot of downsides or things that I hated. I was never going to infringe on anybody's civil liberties by being a finance analyst at a movie studio. And it turns out when you work in a major government agency that is constantly basically drawing the line between what the U.S. Constitution says in the Bill of Rights and what the public interest is in safety or security, you're constantly making that balancing act. And what I found out is that my sort of principles are not widely shared by those who are in FBI management. And so it's a sad thing. I want to add this to the conversation you brought up earlier, because you were talking about all these institutions, these pillars that have been degraded. I realized it while you were talking about it. So I just wanted to share this little reflection. You mentioned you were born in what, 1970? Is that right? So I was born in 1981. I'm a child of the 80s. And the two things that, the things that we have in common that I think people from that period of time know is that the country that we were born in, the way that we believed it existed, would invade the country that we live in right now. It would absolutely try to conquer the United States as it stands in 2024. And that's because those pillars used to mean something. And think about what they took from us as they degraded these things. The specific one that I was reflecting on was immigration. If you, as a guy who was born in 1970, or me, as a guy born in 1981, looked at an immigrant with a successful business in America, we would cheer that person. They would be a hero. And now we hear the term immigrant and we immediately think illegal alien because they have conflated those terms. And we believe that immigration is actually something that is going to bleed us out as opposed to a thing that would enrich us. And that's changed in both of our lifetimes. And they've taken that from us because we used to be able to cheer on somebody that came here and profited from the American system by doing the hard work. Now we actually look very, very side-eyed at them like they might be coming here to defraud our families of the wealth that our country has built up without earning it. And that's really, that's one of the saddest things to think about because they took that from us.
But we are a country of immigrants, all of us, at least at some point in our lineage. And you're right, that's an amazing way of looking at it, because you're right. Back then, immigrants would come here. My wife's family, they came here, they immigrated the right way, they assimilated, they contributed, and it is a success story of sorts. You're right. I agree with that. That's a profound way of looking at it.
It's sad to me, honestly. I mean, how many other things have they taken from us that we used to be able to believe in? I know that when I grew up, my dad was a radio broadcaster, and then eventually a radio executive, and then eventually moved into sports management. And while he was doing that, I grew up around microphones and radio stations, and I grew up around newsrooms of people that actually wanted to tell things that were true. They may have had an opinion, but their goal was to remove themselves from it. And they would do it so imperfectly, but they would do the best they could do. And I met newsmen who actually, if you asked my father what his profession was, that he, eventually retired from, it was newsman. That was a thing. That was a calling almost. But now they look at it as something like a priesthood, that you're indoctrinated to give people the truth and not give people the information and let them decide what is true. And it's just a profound change in these institutions. The same thing with the medical industry, which we've seen change in our lifetimes. The combination, I guess I'm like the oldest millennial is essentially where they tell me I fall in the generational thing. But I have more in common with those from Gen X, which is that I had a totally analog lifestyle right up until about high school or the end of high school. And they took stuff from us. These institutions we used to believe in, the media, we used to have at least a lot more trust in it than we do today. The medical establishment, our governmental agencies, we used to, at least some of us thought, I know there were some people that were far ahead of the curve on this one that thought they were always coming after us. But I think more and more, those institutions have been captured. And I got to witness a lot of it in Washington, D.C. 5 years in D.C. is a lifetime, by the way, if you're a bright person that looks around and sees what's going on. When you see these institutions captured and you can see it happening in real time, it's really awful to witness that there was a time when people were so proud of being an FBI agent. That was the defining moment of their life. And I've had friends who retired from the FBI after 27 years that told me that they no longer tell people that they spent their life as an FBI agent. They hide that fact from their neighbors when they move. And they move into a new neighborhood. They don't want to be associated with something that they spent a quarter of a century working for. And that is a theft too. They've stolen that from us too.
You very eloquently said what I've been trying to say on all these podcasts for a very long time, that it is a sense of sadness, a sense of something being taken from us, a whitewashing of our culture and our heritage. Just a quick clarification for people who don't know, like me. Can you explain what counterintelligence is? And when you mentioned that you started pushing back right away, who are you talking to? Your superiors, and what are their reactions at that point?
Yeah, sure. So let me answer the first question. Counterintelligence is the work to subvert and to mitigate the efforts of foreign intelligence to steal things from Americans. That could be information, that could be technologies, that can be, there are actually techniques to actually export technologies. Specifically, it's called tech transfer, where they will, develop a technology in the United States, then they will steal the scientists away and have them, co-develop it over in their own country. So counterintelligence is a broad spectrum of stopping things like spying and espionage, which I did not do, but I've worked on cases that were part of it. To foreign influence campaigns, that's a piece of it as well. That's always kind of a touchy subject because the FBI doesn't really have a enforcement function there. And then actual crimes, espionage, technology transfers, what they call ITAR products, which are things that are forbidden for exporting outside of the United States, technologies that are protected by either DoD contracts or things like that. So that's what broadly counterintelligence is. But just for people's understanding, most people assume that the FBI, which is what I used to do, you have a badge and a gun for a reason, that you're law enforcement. And unfortunately, in our lifetimes, that shifting balance, there's always been a small version of the national security mission for the FBI. I think it has gotten dramatically bigger since 9/11. And that's been my sort of understanding by talking to a lot of people with a ton of experience. But the FBI has two sides of one coin. One of them is the law enforcement. That's criminal activity that they go and investigate and then prosecute. And the other version of it is national security, which is counterintelligence and counterterrorism. And those are both probably the two most dangerous pieces. And while it previously was probably a 15 or a 10% part of the mission to do the intelligence work, it's now 50, 60, maybe 70% of what the FBI does. And so they've gotten so far afield from their original mission set that the simple work of doing criminal is not looked upon as being sophisticated or a way to advance your career. And if you'll indulge me for 1 second, for people to just have a real easy way to understand this, because it's the one thing that I keep I repeat it over and over again. There are things that you and I both probably repeat so people hear it, because it's just anybody who can hear it will be better off. Criminal investigations are linear, and they are not threatening to the American people in the same way. Linear investigations have some sort of instigation point. That's what we call predication. That means a federal crime took place and there's an allegation or information that it did. And then we go find the victims, we go find the perpetrators, we try to build evidence, and then we take it through court, and they either plead out or we take it to trial, and that person either goes to jail or is acquitted. And that's it. There's some appeals, and that's a linear process. Intelligence investigations are cyclical. They're circular and they never end. In fact, when they talk about intelligence, they talk about an intelligence cycle. And national security investigations are cyclical. They last forever. They often last for a long time. Here's an egregious example. I once went on a search warrant for a member of a mosque in Northern Virginia who was accused of possessing child pornography. And what I found out when we were doing the surveillance on this guy before they did the actual search warrant is that they had an open case on him for almost 30 years. He'd been investigated for 30 years by the federal government with no allegation of a crime, just what we call threats, that he might in fact fall underneath a counterterrorism banner. And so they investigated him for 30 years and eventually found him to have evidence of an actual crime. But the criminal investigation took 30 years to advance. To me, that is weaponized government, even though I don't want people being child pornographers, and I certainly don't want anyone exploiting children. We have to use our tools responsibly. And so to be able to keep a case open for 30 years is shocking to most people. And what they finally got him for was not the thing that they were actually investigating him for. And that leads you to what the dangers are. That's how I ended up getting involved in this whistleblower activity. So I'll just kind of broadly say, I brought whistleblower activity to Congress, and that's why I'm notorious, if you will, or why I have some notoriety in the public sphere. But whistleblowing activity is actually defined by statute. And it means that you take information that are allegations in good faith. They don't have to be true. They just have to be allegations that make sense to the person of criminal activity, violation of rule, policy, or law. Law would be the criminal version of it. And then the last one is whether it's like a gross public safety issue. And the last thing that you could fall under there is what they call fraud, waste, and abuse. So that's the misuse of government resources. If you have a credible allegation of these things that you bring forward in good faith, you can bring forward them in very, very narrow approved channels as an FBI agent, as a member of the CIA, as someone from the NSA, and anything in the national security world. You have to follow these narrow spaces. And that includes going to your management, your supervisors, going to someone outside of your management, but that is also a senior position within your agency. You can go to one of the watchdog agencies within your agency. In my case, it's called the Office of Professional Responsibility, or like an internal affairs. You can also go to the DOJ, the broader entity. So FBI sits underneath DOJ, and they have their own Office of Professional Responsibility and their own investigators, what they call the Office of Inspector General. So I could have gone to those, and I've done all of these, by the way. Every single one of these things, I've made allegations to everything along the chain. And then you can also go outside of all of those, and you can bring it to like the EEO, the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission. And so you can have them investigate, and I've done that as well. And then lastly, you can bring it to a member of Congress, which is guaranteed to you under federal statute as well. And so each one of these things are legally considered to be whistleblower activities, and I've done every single one of them starting in 2017. But when you're doing that and you're telling your supervisor, I think this is illegal, I don't think we're allowed to do this, I feel like we're violating our own policies, that doesn't feel like you're being a whistleblower as you see written on the title of a headline. So it's just trying to be a good employee. And I did all that early on. The first thing that I brought to them is that we had cases open for 8 years that I inherited, things that Peter Strzok actually opened, signed off on them opening. So that's kind of weird. But they were investigations of Americans who were federal government employees, and some that had applied to the federal government, and some that were just in the vicinity of the governmental apparatus that had no allegation of criminal wrongdoing. And we had found their bank account numbers. We had gone into and looked at all their finances. We had interviews of people around them. We had talked to their former coworkers. And I'm reading these files as a brand new agent at 36 years old, sitting in my first desk there for 10 hours a day, and knowing that we had capture and information. And I closed out all of the original files I got. I think I got probably like 6 or 8 opening investigations. I closed every single one of them administratively, with no action taken, because there was no criminality there. They simply were things that they had exhausted all the things that could possibly be done, and those people had done nothing wrong, and they never had a reason for the FBI to investigate them, certainly not under a criminal matter. But I would argue also not even for the sake of national security. They seem to be open for their own sake. that it was make work is what we would call it in the military, where you're just doing things because you need to do something. So you might as well do this thing. And it turns out that something was taking Americans' private information and putting it in a government database and computer forever. And it's classified as secret or higher. So they will not be released for 25 to 50 years. And people who had these investigations in them will never know they did. And I said, what are we doing? That was my question to my manager and to my boss's boss. I said, what are we doing here? And they said, we're just getting more information. And I said, yes, but to do what with it? Because I came from an action-oriented world where if you had information, then you would either go do a direct action and maybe you go find it. Your goal was to go attack an enemy position. Or your goal was as a medic that I'm going to learn things about what's going wrong with Andy's body so I could stop him from bleeding, or I could help him breathe, or I could make sure that his heart is not going to stop. So I would have a reason for this information. And they would go, well, if we know more things, then we just will have more information. And I was like, no, that's what knowing more things means. That's not what you do with it. What do we want to do? And they said, we're going to use it to collect more information. That's that circle.
When you inherit these case files, doesn't it have that opening statement that this guy we think is doing this? Or do
Yep.
so you have an idea what it's all about. And for 8 years, they didn't find anything. So then they open it up and give it to you as a newbie. See if you can find something. Is that pretty much it?
It gets passed off. We would call it like a dog with fleas sometimes. So it's a dog that nobody else wants to deal with it. So you just get it because you're the lowest guy in the totem pole. But yeah, the opening statement, like everything else, every investigation has to have a mission or a purpose. So they open it up under what they call predication. And the problem is that if you went to the FBI Academy and you thought you were going to be an 1811, that's the government job series code, of criminal investigator, and then you find out that you're not going to do criminal investigations, you're going to do intelligence investigations, you suddenly realize, and I certainly realized, that we weren't starting from a place of a criminal allegation was there. What we were alleging is that a person might be targeted by a threat country, or that this person had done some sort of alerting behavior, which, by the way, is constitutionally protected, like freedom of association, or freedom of expression, or their ability to speak. And we were going to then investigate to find out whether or not there was more there. And in doing so, once it's open, they don't have to close it because they can continue to generate predication under some really, really ugly pieces that are classified. The entire FBI operates under a playbook. That's called the DIOG. It's the Domestic Intelligence Operations Guide. And that playbook, which is like yay thick if you were to print it out, and we had printed copies as well, that playbook tells you how to open it, when you can open it, what tools you can use at what stages. But it also, it gives you a couple of little tiny paragraphs at the end in what are called the appendixes. Appendix G, like golf, is the specific one that I continue to call out to my members of Congress that have done nothing about it. And that particular paragraph under Appendix G allows an intelligence investigation to be opened under anybody in America if it's properly stated. And I can state it about anybody that I've ever met. I don't think I would have a hard time articulating a reason to open an intel investigation to anybody. I certainly could open one into you. I know there's one into me.
I think about that all the time, Kyle, because I'm saying these things. Are they watching me? Are they listening to me? I got nothing to hide, but I think about that sometimes. And when
it's not their right to do that, though. That's not when our government is serving us. It's serving itself. And so that's the big problem, is that so many people say, well, yeah, I don't have anything to hide, or I don't need to use encrypted apps, or, if the government knows what I'm about, so be it, no big deal. I'm not running from anybody. But the fact of the matter is the government has no right to do that. You have rights, but they don't. The government exists to serve and to preserve your rights. And if you understand that, if you took the oath the way that I did, which is say that I'm supposed to protect and defend the Constitution, I didn't really go out there and swear allegiance to the articles, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that says how the government works. What I did was say that the Bill of Rights is very important, and that my job is to make sure our government, as a implementation of the government, as a special agent of the government, right? My job was to make sure that I didn't step over the charter that I had signed up for, which is that we don't investigate people for free speech. We don't go after them simply because they are keeping and bearing arms. And we don't infringe on their right to be secure in their persons, places, and things. And the government does this on a regular basis. The government specifically being the intelligence apparatus, but more specifically the FBI that I saw. And that's wrong. And so anyway, it took me a while to get to the point where I was going to Congress, but I did. And that happened in 2021. And my life has never been the same since then, because that's kind of a career-ending move.
I would say so. And I was going to ask you what the turning point was that felt we compelled to speak about this, but you've kind of answered it. So I'll say in hindsight, what would you say has been the most surprising or disheartening discovery about the internal culture at the FBI? And I mean, are there hopes, do you think, that this is something that can be fixed? Do you have to completely, start from scratch and get rid of everyone? Or, I mean, there must be lots of very good people at the FBI. This is coming from way above. So how does this get resolved?
Yeah, so numerically, there are plenty of good people, but statistically, there are not that many, it turns out. And so that's really troubling. We're talking about an agency that has about 36 or 38,000 people total and employees. And obviously, there are good people there. There are people that are even doing bad things that are good people. Here's kind of the tipping point, because it actually was very specific for me. Two things happened at once, because I'm kind of a bonehead and I don't necessarily take God's prodding the way that I maybe ought to. They actually happened simultaneous to my wife going through conversion to Catholicism. So she had started as someone who lived in New York and grew up in New York and more or less had a sort of a godless existence. It just wasn't part of her family's tradition. And which was, I think, less common, but it was more common in very academic type focused places like New York City, and people that kind of they thought they were above it. So it was kind of interesting to see that. My wife was converting to Catholicism, and I was told in September of 2021 that the Biden administration was going to require every single person in federal service to get a COVID vaccine shot. And I objected to that on pro-life grounds, and also to the fact on a medical basis, I'd already had the disease and I got it on duty, and it was well documented. And I'd survived it with a wife who had been pregnant at the time. And there was no other option at treatment when I got it in 2020. So there was no other choice. And I don't get vaccines for things that I've already had. That doesn't make any sense to me. I was a medical provider for over 10 years. And so that was a no-go for me. And secondarily, right after that, within 2-3 weeks, I got an email that was not sent to me, but was forwarded to me by someone else in my office who thought it was problematic, but didn't do anything about it. And the email said that the Attorney General, the email said that the FBI was going to be investigating parents at school board meetings and using the intelligence tag EDU officials. Now, the FBI has kind of quibbled about whether that's what it meant or not, but I was an investigator for a living, and I know what intelligence products are, and I know why you tag certain intelligence. And I also was a voracious follower of the news, and I knew that 5 days earlier, the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, had gotten into a bunch of hot water because he had accepted a letter from the National Association of School Boards saying that they were wanting to call parents domestic terrorists if they were protesting, masking and books and DEI and all the other kind of nonsense that was going on. And he said, under oath, that he did not see any situation where the DOJ would use counterterrorism resources or Patriot Act tools to target parents. And then 5 days later, we get this email from the Assistant Director of Counterterrorism at the FBI, which is the action arm of the DOJ. And so my allegation that I brought forward was that it was possible the AG perjured himself, which is a very specific claim. That's a violation of federal law in addition to policy. So it's not like I don't like the way that we're doing this, or I don't think we should investigate parents, because you can investigate all kinds of people for all kinds of reasons, as I shared. But I do know that you can't lie in front of Congress. And so my allegation was that at the same time that I told them under no uncertain terms that as a faithful Catholic, I was not going to be getting those shots. I had serious pro-life concerns about the way they were developed, and that is my right. That doesn't mean they have to accommodate me, by the way. I knew that. They could fire me, and I decided that was okay. But what's funny is they didn't go through that process. They chose not to acknowledge anybody's religious accommodation requests, which are required. You know this as an employer. You have to evaluate them under Title VII. And I had a sincerely held belief, which has nothing to do with whether or not it's accepted by a Catholic church or by any other institution. It's Kyle Seraphin's belief. That's the way our federal laws are written, which is brilliant. And so I had these beliefs. They were not addressed. And then they said, you know what? We're not going to be able to win this. By the way, they ended up losing that because of lawsuits that I helped file. But they said, we're going to go after something else. We're going to make sure that you show compliance to our regime and what we're doing. You must swab your nose for COVID every 72 hours, prophylactically. There's no medical precedent for doing that ever. And I'd been in medicine, and I'd worked in emergency rooms, and I'd been a technician as a paramedic. I had done hundreds, if not thousands, of nasal swabs in my time. And I maybe swabbed somebody once or twice a year when they thought they had the flu, when they had symptoms, by the way. And I just told them, under no circumstances am I going to highlight myself as a conscientious Christian simply because you want me to bow down to your regime. By the way, these legal arguments are now being upheld, and they are being evaluated in court in the Southern District of Texas. So I have an ongoing lawsuit for religious discrimination where a judge appointed by a Democrat looked at it and said, this is obviously not acceptable. And it survived the motion to dismiss. So we'll see where it goes in the end of court. But dead to rights, they were wrong. And I knew they were wrong. And that actually hardened me in my ability to stand on this thing. And as that happened, they immediately pulled my badge and my gun and my security clearances and kicked me out of the office. So I was on unpaid suspension for a combined total of 14 months. So imagine having a job where they say you're part of the company, but you're not allowed to tell anybody you're part of the company, and you're not going to get paid, and you can't show up to the company, and you can't do anything with it. And by the way, if you go get another job, we're going to fire you for violating company policies. That was my situation.
Holy crap. I don't even know where to go with that one. I mean, that's just, well, it's fascinating, and it's also quite concerning and frightening. So you go and you testify, and you say all of these things, and I understand why you would, but that's what I was saying earlier in the introduction, why I want people to follow you. You are a man of integrity and tremendous courage and moral character. I'd love to have someone like you having my back all the time, for sure. I'll tell you that much. But I will say...
I'll tell you something, Andy. One of the things that's so wild, because you hear the word courage bandied around, and that's kind of awkward if you're a grown man and other people say, oh, that's so courageous, or people call you heroic, and that also sounds really weird. There's two things that are true simultaneously. Number one is that I didn't do anything for Americans by and large, because I don't deal with Americans in a vacuum. I don't know like the concept of Americans. What I looked at, and I think most parents can associate with this, is I looked at my children. And I've got 4 now. I had 3 at the time. And I simply was talking to my wife about it. And I said, what are we going to do? Because I don't know what other job I would go get. And I still don't know what other job I would go get. It's just like my background is suited to do one thing really well, which is federal law enforcement, or maybe some sort of, kinetic military operations. That's what I'm trained for. It's what I spent over a decade putting together. But I said, I don't want to look my kids in the eye in 18 years or 15 years after I retire, when the country has slipped away and it is no longer recognizable in any way, and them say, what were you doing, Dad, when this country was falling apart? And have to answer them, well, I kept my paycheck and I kept my pension so that your mom and I were able to survive in our retirement, and we were able to keep a roof over your heads. That didn't seem like an acceptable answer to me. So it's so much more narrow than this broad idea of like, I want to serve the American people, because it's really hard for people to get that idea. Like, I don't know the American people, neither do you. We have a vague concept, but I know my kids, and I know that they're smart. I know they're going to ask questions one day. So I just looked into the future, and I didn't want future Kyle to have to answer that I didn't do the right thing because it was complicated, difficult, or financially discomforting. And it's very uncomfortable to not get paid for 14
You're
months.
a humble dude, and I would still say it's courageous as hell. You stood up for all of us who don't have the ability to do it, and all of the parents and all of the kids. You can say that you did it for your kids, and I respect that. But I think it's a lot deeper than that. So, the question I'm sure you get, everyone asks you, I bet. I mean, if you were my buddy, probably the first question I'd ask you, about retribution. Has there been any consequences other than losing your job? Has there been anything that you care to share in terms of retaliation or things that, are a direct result of you pushing back against guys like Merrick Garland, of people of very high power and influence?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, while I was suspended from the Bureau, I had ATF agents show up at my house. One of the things that people knew about me inside my own office, which was small, is that I own guns and I love guns. I like buying them. I like building them. I like working on them. I had a SWAT guy come in one time and asked me how to put a trigger in his AR, because he was a SWAT sniper that didn't understand how his own weapon systems work. And I'm like, yeah, bring it over here. I'll do it with a ballpoint pen. I've built rifles for FBI agents, like for their personal use, in the back of a trunk after work, because I had the tools and I brought them with me, and I can put together a lower like very quickly, and I can tolerance an upper once I got it home to my bench. So guns are a thing that I spent a lot of time, money, and I have a lot of interest in. And so I had the ATF show up at my house, which is very unsettling. I was out of the country, or I was out of the state at the time. So I was dealing with them on a ring cam. And luckily, because of the providence of being in touch with the people I've been able to meet, I had a very capable gun lawyer on speed dial, and I had him reach out to the ATF, and they immediately disengaged and went away. But that's a little unsettling. You don't know when the ATF might come in and try to have some false pretense. They don't have a great record of going into people's houses, so that's something.
So, well, to that question real quick, let me just stop for 1 second. Remember your thought. What's that like? Are they coming and knocking on the door, or are they coming in a way that would alert everyone on the street that you got to get to your house?
No, it was a knock on the door. There was a guy there that I didn't recognize, but he had introduced himself as an ATF agent in the ring cam, and then the guy behind him, who I've referred to as Walmart Texas Ranger, because he was kind of wearing this like cheap vest and a silly hat. Those two guys stood out there in the door. So it was a classic law enforcement knock and talk. Luckily, I'm familiar with the technique. I know what's going on there. I also knew that it was a fishing expedition because they were asking for something that I didn't have. But the thing is I had a part shipped to the FBI's field office because I wanted to see it, and I knew that I should probably look at it at work to see what it was all about. It was a Chinese thing that they make these knockoffs. It was not illegal in and of itself, but could be turned into something illegal if some processes were applied to it. It's called a solvent trap. So I had it shipped to the FBI's office, and they came to my home asking where it was. And it's like, I don't know if you guys got the news flash, but I don't get to work there anymore. Maybe go knock on my old office's door. So that was, to me, whether that was intentional or it was just a moment of accidental intimidation, that's something that stood out to me. Additionally, I applied to another federal job. I was like, look, if I'm not going to be able to work for the FBI and do so in good conscience, so be it. I'm going to go and try to get a job with another agency doing a mission set that I can get behind. And I'm a veteran, and I love veterans, and I think the VA has been better or worse in various areas that I've been in. In Texas, it's actually quite amazing. In the DC area, it's atrocious. So I was like, well, I'll go work for the Inspector General of the VA. I applied for a job. I was made it to the final round because I was a federal employee already, and I was already a GS-13, which was the upper level of what they were looking for. I mean, I'm an FBI agent, for God's sake, so I'm not a lot of FBI agents leaving the FBI to go to the OIG at the VA. And I applied. On my own dollar, I flew out there. Of course, I'm unpaid at the time. I went out and did an interview. The interview was a 1-hour interview. It lasted for 4 because they showed me where my office was and told me where I should be living. And we were discussing the logistics of moving up to the area, up in Spokane, Washington. It was my job because under certain terms, I'm not just a vet, but I'm also listed as a disabled vet under the VA. So I've got empathy with disabled veterans. I've got the background as law enforcement. This was a shoe-in job. And I'm very confident if the discovery ever comes out that we were blackballed from that position as well, which would have been an easy walk into another job doing federal law enforcement and be able to continue my retirement path. But that's not what God had in mind for me, obviously. I had to be challenged a little bit more. And then lastly, and probably the most unsettling of all of this stuff, is I've had the FBI subpoena my social media accounts, which is how I know that there are investigations into me. And I had someone reach out through a friend, a proxy, that said, tell Seraphin to watch his back because for at least the next 3 years, they're going to be gunning for him. And I just participated in a 45-minute meeting at the J. Edgar Hoover building with people from DOJ looking to try to pin an obstruction of justice charge on him, that they are actively having meetings with my name being the topic and talking so they can try to figure out how to do this thing. And there are ways that unscrupulous prosecutors could probably try to construe what I did as being illegal, which is the weirdest piece of it. Now, I know that I'm in the right. I know that I'm morally in the right. I know that I'm legally in the right if all the cards are played out. But if I'm charged in somewhere like DC where you see people that simply just walked into the Capitol building or getting hit with these nasty, prison sentences, there's a real possibility that they take my freedom. And my buddies and I we were not unaware of this being a possibility, to the point where former FBI agents won't come and speak out. Retired people regularly tell me that they're terrified of doing something because what they don't want to do is have their pension removed. And that's how vindictive the FBI and the DOJ at large are towards people that break the cardinal rule, which is not breaking the law, by the way. The cardinal rule is do not embarrass the FBI. And I've done that. I've thrown a lot of egg on their face, and I've tarnished up that badge as best I can because I think the American people have a right to know the right answer. And then wherever the chips fall after that is the American people's business as voters. But it's not the FBI's business to keep their own secrets dirty, and quiet and hidden. It should be exposed because the American taxpayer pays for it. So when I started sharing stuff, I said, this is not my information at the end of the day. This is not Kyle Seraphin's whistleblower activity. This is just things that are happening and we're all paying for it. So we ought to know. And I'm not breaking any laws and I'm certainly not violating national security principles. What I'm doing is exposing dirty policy laundry and bad tactics by terrible management. And if that's a problem for them, then they should probably look in the mirror, which is what I also advise them to do. The stuff they were doing, I think, is genocidal, Andy, at the end of the day. I think it is an absolutely straight line It's a long line, but it is a straight line from the kind of compliance that we saw during the COVID tyranny that they took on, to trying to get their people to do the exact same thing, to going after pro-lifers at abortion clinics that are simply praying or singing hymns, to putting people into train cars and death camps. And the wildest thing is, and this might be, you may not have heard this before, but every single FBI agent, at least since Director Mueller, went to the Holocaust Museum in DC, the Holocaust Memorial Museum, and they go through a specialized program, which people get real conspiratorial about, but it's put on by the ADA and the FBI as a joint animal. And they teach you what the signs are that 1930s Germany and 1930s German cops and politicians ignored in order to get to the Holocaust that happened during the Nazi occupation. And if you don't know what it looks like incremental tyranny. It doesn't start with death camps. It starts with people saying, go get the names of all those Jews that are living in that building, or go find out all the Jewish people that are living in this neighborhood. And then telling, we got to round them all up and put them all in the same place for their safety and for our safety. They're not like us. And that's exactly what I saw them doing as they were doing a mandate for COVID, because the people who resisted it were exclusively Christian. They were exclusively people of faith, maybe not only Christian, but I'm sure there were Jewish people as well that had the same thought that said, this is not something you can demand of me. And so every single person I met had a religious faith that was being violated. And I saw that going in a directly straight line to something genocidal. And when I called that out, and I called it out to my management by name, they were all ashamed, but it didn't stop them from doing the same thing that the good Germans did in Nazi Germany, which is to follow orders and do what they were told. And follow orders they knew were wrong. You asked earlier about whether or not it can be saved. Certainly none of the management structure can be.
When you hear the Democratic Party comparing Trump to Nazis,
yeah,
do you think that's intentional?
I think it's two things. Yes, I think that the people that are actually writing this kind of script and pushing this out starts off as somebody doing it very intentionally with purpose. But I also think it comes from a place of historical ignorance, because I think a lot of Americans are also ignorant about our own history and world history. And I found this with my own sister, who's educated. She's working on a PhD right now. She has a master's degree in nursing. She's not dumb by any means, and she's not uneducated by any means. But when we sat one time a couple of years ago, and I just said, what is your grasp of American history? Just tell me the major world conflicts that the U.S. has been involved in the 20th century, for example. What decade did World War I happen? She didn't know. She didn't want to hazard a guess. The same thing for Vietnam, the same thing for Korea, the same thing for World War II. She probably could pick out the Gulf War because she lived through it. But at the end of the day, she was historically ignorant in a big way. And I think many Americans are very, very ignorant. They don't know what fascist means. Fascist means someone that I don't like. Fascist is a thing that I bandy about in a political way. If you are too aggressive and you're mean, then you are a fascist. But that's not what fascism is. I just played a clip earlier today from Ronald Reagan, who very easily defined it in the 1980s. So it's not like it's been that foreign to people. It was always that there's private ownership of companies and that there is a heavy hand of government that says who's going to win and lose by following the favored government policies. So it's sort of like an authoritarian version instead of doing it the communist way. So Donald Trump is not a fascist. But what I see the left doing right now, the political left, the Democrat Party, they're engaging in legitimate fascism. They were getting the social media companies to comply. They were getting the pharmaceutical companies to comply. They were getting the medical establishment and the healthcare companies to comply. They leaned on these people, and they straight up told anybody who had more than 100 employees, using OSHA of all things, that you had to comply with their preferred policy or you were going to be facing sanctioning and loss of licensure and so on. That's what fascism looks like. So it's almost like projection, but I think it's deeper than that, because the propaganda messaging is so pervasive that if you don't know what things mean, and you have a feeling about them, which is that fascism is bad, then you're going to be more likely to be ensnared by this stuff. And the craziest thing is I found people talking back to the 1940s. In 1943, the American Communist Party pushed out a dictate that said the people that are resistant to our preferred policies should be labeled as fascists and anti-Semites. And the reason why is because there's such a nasty smell associated with those words that if you repeat it enough, it'll stick. And if you get it to stick on someone, you will discredit them forever. And what has Donald Trump been called? He's been called a fascist and an anti-Semite. He's been called a racist and a bigot. And I don't know that Donald Trump is a saint. I don't think he is. He's got 3 marriages, and I'm sure he's got some skeletons, but they've all been exposed, and they were all baked into the cake by the time he walked down that escalator. So at the end of the day, How do you get, there's no way to be outraged about someone who's lived his life out loud in public and was kind of like the classic version of what we thought New York 1980s money looked like. It was gold toilets and supermodels and buying things with a check that was absurd, including like offering money for how much for the kid, like he had a really funny sense of what it meant to be kind of like FU money in America, which was something that we all used to sort of smile at and say, look, not the most Christian example, but certainly an American thing that we all kind of laugh about.
Absolutely. I mean, that's what capitalism is. I heard you speaking with another FBI agent this morning. Excuse me, you got to forgive me for not remembering his name, but you were talking about fascism, and it came up, and I found you were kind of saying these same things. I found it very enlightening. And this has been fascinating. Kyle has gone a whole different direction than I anticipated. So in the spirit of respecting your time, and I really appreciate all the time you spent with me. It's been an amazing hour. I read something that you posted just the other day, since we're on the subject of the election. You write, Director Christopher Wray visits the National Election Command Post located at #FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. The command post will be staffed 24/7 for election week. Don't worry, y'all. Chris Wray and the FBI are staffed up 24/7 for some reason. So I got one other question after this question. But what does that say to you? What are they preparing for? What are they telling you? And what do you think when you hear that?
The FBI is part of it's just like every other governmental agency. And people who've been working inside the Beltway know the expression, the self-licking ice cream cone, which is like the most meaningless and stupid product that could exist. An ice cream cone that licks itself doesn't need a buyer, right? It doesn't need a consumer because it's its own consumer. And the FBI is its own consumer. It's a product without a mission set at this point in a lot of ways. It exists because it needs to exist for itself to exist. Or as someone once told me in a very dumb way, people need jobs. And so it's a federal jobs program. It does have a mission, but it's gotten so far away from it. They've staffed up an election headquarters because that's what they've been told that needs to be done. And they have a budget that says that they're going to secure the election. But it doesn't mean the same thing to you and me that they're going to secure the election. What they've said is that they are not going to be interested in fraud because they've already predetermined that there is no fraud or not enough of it to matter, which is troubling for those of us who saw things in 2020 that looked like it needed a real serious investigation by a real serious group of people, maybe some FBI agents on the election fraud task force that had a decade worth of experience. What we found out is those people got moved off those jobs and they were told they were no longer necessary. Most of them because they were religious people, because they happen to have 7 or 8 or 9 kids and they look like they were old school Mormon or Catholics that wanted to procreate in the world. And that meant that they were religious, and religious meant that they were conservative, and conservatives voted for Donald Trump in the mind of the FBI, and therefore they couldn't do that work. That is absurd. That is actually a factually accurate thing that happened in Washington field office. So we've been told that the DOJ is not interested in election fraud. They're interested in voter suppression, which I don't even know happens. I don't know that there's any evidence of it happening, but voter suppression sounds like something that happened in the 1960s in the Jim Crow South. And that's what the FBI is trying to adjudicate. Why? Because it is the preferred crime. It's the preferred focus of the Democrat Party masters that do, in fact, run FBI policy. You asked if there are good people. Of course there are good people. I'm friends with good people that work within the FBI. But I don't think they're a majority of it, and they certainly aren't the people making the decisions. And so when I see Chris Wray is standing up an election, crime task force, that's lipstick on a pig is what we used to say, right? It's just dressing something up to act like we're doing something, but there's no actual function. My buddy sent me a message after that came out, and he said some 23-year-old secretary, we call them OSTs, some 23-year-old OST will be manning a phone that never rings because there's endless phone trees as you dial in to call it in. And when they get it, they're not going to know how to report it because the allegation of crime is not going to be investigated, and there's no prosecutable interest by the DOJ. So the animals have already predetermined what the outcome looks like on their end. So if there is fraud, and there's certainly a possibility of it, the FBI is not going to be the ones who check it out. They've already told us that. That bothers me.
That's disheartening.
It's unacceptable is what it is.
This is why people need to follow you, Kyle. This is why people need to listen and understand what's happening. And you are a true patriot. And I know the other people, not just me, I'm sure after listening to this will thank you for that. And I hope many of them follow you. I know I will from now on, and everything you put out. It's an honor to sit here and talk with you. Last question I got for you. This is the softball one. This one's easy. Everything else that you said wasn't so easy, but this is, and that is, and I guess I kind of want to know it too, because, everything that you've done to get to where you are, everything you've given up to get to where you are, what do you hope that your listeners on your podcast, on this show, and everyone who comes in contact with your story, what do you hope that is taken away from that? What message do you want people to take from this, and what message are you telling people each week on your podcast?
The message is actually hopeful, even though the times seem really dire. I don't get into doom and gloom. I don't believe that is helpful. I also don't think that there's any precedent or any promise that was made that says, God's special hand is protecting America. It will always endure as the shining city on the hill that we grew up learning about when 70s and 80s. That was the instinct that we were the good guys and we will always be the good guys. I don't know that that's true as much anymore. But that doesn't mean that the people who are around you, the actual Americans, and I would get it more granular, your community, your neighbors, I think those people are still worthy of fighting. So you don't fight for this vague concept. You don't try to make sure that America endures in the way that it always has. It's probably going to evolve into something different. And that's okay, because the founding fathers were actually anti-federalists at the end of the day. That's why we have a Bill of Rights. The funny thing is we hear people on the conservative side always talking about the Federalists and the Federalists and the Federalist Papers. And this is this idea. The federal government is sort of the enemy. That's how we got it all signed. It was a compromise to say that anti-federalists knew that government will always overreach. So I do think we need a new rebirth of understanding our own civics. This is what I preach. I do sort of like secular sermons, if you will, about learning your history and learning what your government is about, learning what is supposed to take place, and then understanding. If you don't know what's supposed to take place, you don't know how disordered things are today. If you don't know that in 1913, America fundamentally changed and lost a bunch of really, really important capabilities, whether it be on the monetary side, whether it be on the political side, where we started directly electing senators and we subverted the Senate, whether these things, like the fact that we have an income tax now that didn't exist. America was a proper country at one point in time. And I think that even if it's only in fragments of America, it will still be a proper country in the future. And we're all going to have a different experience of it. That used to be the beauty of the American experience. There are 50 laboratories for freedom, and you got to choose which one you wanted to be in and how you wanted it to run. And I think if we get back to that, I think that things are looking great. But I think in the short term, it's going to be very bumpy. And I think that what I tell people to do is, number one, love your neighbor. That's a biblical command, but it's also a really practical piece of advice, because if you know that your neighbor is not your enemy, you won't be taking up arms locally against those who are in your community, and you can stave off a lot of strife. And so, the general message is hope, but row for the shore, which is to say, take the actions that are within your own power in your own sphere, and don't wait to do them. Nobody will come and ask you. I did a speech in Idaho. And they introduced me, and I had a whole idea of what I was going to talk about. And I completely forgot when they said my name, which is a really fun thing to do. I don't go up with notes. So you go up and you're ready to do the speech. And they said, and now we have this FBI whistleblower, and his name is Kyle Seraphin. And I walked up and I took the mic and I looked around and I blanked completely. And I said, here I am, which is something that I always say. If you call me, Andy, if you're in the same room as me and you go, hey, Kyle, I'll say, here I am. I always say this. I say it to my children. I say it to strangers. Here I am comes from Isaiah 6:8. And it means that you're ready for tasking. And so that I sort of always say, like, the moment that we all had, like, that's already happened. If you're thinking, man, I should do something, I should say something, I need to do, maybe somebody else will do it. They haven't done it. It's you. Here you are right now. You are being called if people don't know it. And so I empower people to just say, look, you don't have to wait for anyone to respond. Like, you're the hope that you are waiting for. You are the thing that your kids are hoping you will be. Just go be it. And it's going to be really uncomfortable, and it's going to be absolutely terrifying most of the time. And you will have no idea if it's going to be successful until later, but you need to do it or we all lose. So we don't have any choice. We've basically come to the last line. We've given up an awful lot. I don't think America can survive in the way that it is today, losing much more. But that doesn't mean that you can't survive and your community can't survive if you start drawing that line today. And you just say, this is the red line. We don't infringe. We do not discriminate, regardless of whether you agree with me or not. Doesn't matter who you voted for. Americans have innate God-given rights. They predate this government. And if you understand that, which is basic civics, by the way, that's like not sexy anymore, but that's what it is. You just go, okay, we're going to do better. We're going to do better because we can do better, because we have done better, and we need to do better for the next generation This is old stuff. The handing down of ideas from father to son, the way that things have done for all of human time. There's nothing like really novel under the sun, but the wisdom has been there. And as you said, this novel idea of boys can be girls and girls can be boys and people in locker rooms they don't belong in, it's a fad, it's a fad. It's a trend that's happening now. But the truth is that there's been a real truth that has been around for all of human history. And we'll get back there, just probably only in small pockets at a time.
Well, God bless you, Kyle, brother. I mean, the luckiest guy in America, know your neighbor, is Kyle Seraphin's neighbor. You certainly, he hit the jackpot when you moved in next door. That is for sure. Kyle, how can more people find out about you? I'm going to put all of this in the description below, but what's the best way for people to stay on top of what you're doing?
Yeah, I'm most active on Twitter, which is now called X. I'm on @Kyle Seraphin, so just my full name, Seraphin is how you spell that. That's the easiest way. I have open DMs, so people interact with me all the time there. We also have a locals channel that people can check out, and it'll divert you to the podcast and everything else. And that's just KyleSeraphin.com. I just have a redirect, so very simple. I just will go with the name. I didn't plan it this way, but it turns out that it's not a very common name, so I don't have to compete with a lot of people in that space. KyleSeraphin.com or @KyleSeraphin.
Right on. And I highly encourage people to do that. Kyle, this has been an amazing hour, and thank you for coming on. I would love to pick up with you where we left off, and hopefully someday, share a beer with you and hear some of your stories that you may not want to tell online. I'd love to spend an evening with you learning more about you, but for what it's worth, you have my admiration and my respect in immeasurable ways. And thanks for doing what you're doing. Keep it up. There are people that are following. I'm one of them, and I will do what I can to get more people on your bandwagon, following what you're doing, and be enlightened, because there's nothing worse than someone who is very opinionated, like you said, who doesn't know the facts or the history. They're just opinionated because that's the fad of the day. Everyone has the right to be opinionated, but in my mind, do so with being informed, and you're a good place to start for getting some real information about what's happening. So, as they say, may we live in interesting times. That's a Chinese curse, and these are interesting. I think it's going to get much more interesting over the next week or so, but I really thank you for coming on. I'm going to try to get this out to the public immediately before the election, as we're recording this the day before the election. And Kyle, thanks again, man. I can't wait to pick up where we left off, but I hope you and your family and everyone else watching this stays well. And says a prayer for the United States. I think we need one to get back to the way that it used to be, and the way that you're talking, and I for one am on your bandwagon. So again, thanks for coming on, Kyle. Look forward to chatting with you again soon.
I appreciate the opportunity. I had fun. Thanks, Andy.
You got it, man.
Little by Little with Andy Schechtman.